Ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, comrades and friends, today I'm going to be your professor, Ian Phillips, for the class Education 101. This is the third lecture in the series on behavior management, arguably the most important aspect of all of education. But before we get started here, I just want to say timestamps will be in the description below. If you want to skip ahead or refer back to anything, feel free to do so at your own leisure. Before we get started with behavior management, I'm just going to quickly review 1 minute tops, I swear, right? The concept of differentiation from last lecture. So lecture 2 in the series is all about differentiation. We delved into it for an hour straight talking about it. But what is it, right? It's the ability or the practice of altering your instruction or your curriculum to best meet the needs of your students. And that could be anything, right? You can do absolutely anything as long as it's in the best interest of your students, right? That is differentiation. So there's no one right answer. It's not like every single time you hear the word, how did you differentiate this? That you got to just think about technology, right? No, that's not the case, right? It could be technology, or it could be project-based learning. It could be stakeholder engagement. It could be getting a new seating chart. It could be an audiobook, right? It could be a documentary. It could be just you lecturing on the board and standing here. It could be using graphic organizers. There's a million different practices, right? And so one of the takeaways that I wanted you to get is that differentiation means so much that differentiation essentially means nothing at all, right? Because anything that you do, as long as it's in the best interest of your students, is differentiation. All right, so that's the first thing here. Differentiation, and we got that review out of the way. Now we're on to the real bread and butter, right? Arguably, one of the funnest aspects of education to talk about, and one of the most controversial, one of the most important aspects of the entire field. So I'm going to drink my water and we'll get right on into it here, because I've recorded this lecture a couple times here now, and I'm trying to get things perfect, right? So that way you guys are really engaged here. So first off here, we could talk about where misbehavior comes from. Then we're going to talk about its importance, give you some examples, strategies that you can use, examples of just even courses of action, as well as case studies. So we're going to break down actual scenarios that I have encountered in my own teaching practice, right? And you guys will have to, it's going to be interactive, right? Now you can participate if you want, you don't have to, but you can pause the video when you want to and say, look, I would do this for this scenario, right? But you have to have answers to these questions, right? And these are going to be some crazy things. And I try to keep it a little PG, right? Because I have some other crazy stories, but there's just some things in here that you're just going to be like, what? You're like, you've actually encountered that in the 7th grade, right? Or the 8th grade or the 6th grade. And it's like, yes, I have. And you're going to be amazed at what kids can do. So it's not all sunshines and rainbows. So starting off here, I just want to say, when I was a student teacher and a student observer, and I was in all my education classes, one of the things that people harped on about, on and on about, was behavior management. Oh, behavior management this. Oh, behavior management that. Oh, you got to be a good disciplinarian. Oh, discipline that, discipline this, right? And I just, like, for the life of me, I was just like, oh my God, would you guys you drive me insane. I'm like, can you stop and just talk about teaching the kids? I don't care about managing behavior. I'm like, kids don't have behavior issues, right? When I was a kid, and now here's the reason I thought this, right? When I was a kid in the K through 12 system, I was in honors and AP classes my entire life, right? Every single kid in my classes, they sat there like this with their hands crossed, and like, yeah, they talked a little bit, but they barely talked at all, and they were all just like this, little angels, right? Just looking at the board, ready to learn. They were engaging with you constantly. They always did their work all the time. Every single kid in the class wanted a 4.0. And then when I got to the field of education and everybody was saying this, I was like, you guys are just insane. I'm like, I don't know who you're teaching, but you guys have just been dealt a bad hand or something, because I have no idea what you're talking about. That is just so out of anything I've ever experienced in my life. But one of the things that you quickly realize is like, wait a minute, not everybody's like that. Right? And let alone just get to a general classroom, even in places that have AP and honors courses. And then when you get into rougher districts, right, your inner city, urban places, those places are rough, man. And you have absolutely no idea how absolutely difficult and vital behavior management becomes. And then you start to realize it's like, oh, wait a minute, I probably should apologize to those people that I scoffed at and said, well, behavior management isn't important, blah, 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 blah. And so if you're one of those people, right, because oftentimes you teachers are, you little 4.0 students, right, you want to do the best that you can. Everybody around you wants to do the best they can because you're associating with those people and you're in those same classes with them. So it's not anything that you've experienced before in the past, most likely. It could be. You could be an AP or honors teacher, but you most likely won't be, especially when you're a young teacher. And even if you're just a teacher in general, you probably won't be. And so those positions are rare, and people like to scoop them up for obvious reasons. So, well, that's the first thing here. When I was a student teacher, I quickly realized how absolutely rough and difficult that it actually was, and you got to take it very, very seriously. So that's the first thing. Now, we're going to jump on into it first here, the first section of our little PDF. I like using PDFs as opposed to PowerPoints. Where does misbehavior come from? There's a number of different reasons, and this is a very, very controversial topic in general, right? So what is effective behavior management? You'll see down here in the second section. Controversial in nature, right? But really, we could even put it up here too. Where does it come from? Sometimes people will swear, right? They'll get on their hands and knees and swear to you by all the divines. They're like, oh no, it is just a product of their environment. Man, those underprivileged backgrounds cause people to be psychopaths and sociopaths. And, that's just, look, if they were in a better situation, they wouldn't act that way, right? And it's like, yeah, no, that's just not true, right? Is that part of it? Yeah, that's part of it. Are you kidding me? Of course that's part of it, right? But there's a number of different factors influencing misbehavior. And if you think otherwise, that just means you don't know what you're talking about. And so, people, this is very, hits the heart, right? People will swear up and down. And their ideologies politically are going to reflect what they feel about behavior management and where it comes from, and what is effective behavior management, what it should look like. So you have to take that into consideration. There's not necessarily one right answer. Usually it's a mix of answers, and but people are going to be very, very divided on one side or the other. So you got to be careful about who you're talking to about these things, and coming to very, very carefully constructed opinions about them. So you don't want to just jump into anything. So the first thing here is poor socialization. Where does misbehavior come from? Poor socialization. But we're not ignoring anything else, right? We're not ignoring lack of understanding, negative influences, lack of structure, underprivileged backgrounds, personality differences, right? We are simply saying, look, that is just one element of misbehavior and where it comes from, right? So poor socialization, right? What is socialization? What is antisocial behavior? You're going to hear that as a synonym for misbehavior throughout my lecture here. What is antisocial behavior? What is antisocial tendencies? It's the same thing, right? Misbehavior, antisocial tendencies, same thing, all of that. So poor socialization would simply be the fostering of antisocial behaviors, right? And antisocial behaviors are you're not acting in accordance with societal norms and expectations, right? That's basically what antisocial behavior is. It's going against the grain, usually in a negative manner, right? So, so that's antisocial, right? You're behaving against the majority. Or what the majority should look like in an ideal society where, we have laws, we have rules, we have regulations for things. And if you're not abiding by those, or those expectations in terms of how you should act as a proper adult or human being who's respectable to others, that's going to be poor socialization. So where does poor socialization come from, though? That's probably one thing that you're asking yourselves in your head. And, it's a very, very interesting topic. When I was a teacher, I was always coming in under the presumption that antisocial behavior was caused simply by underprivileged backgrounds and, parents who are just, antisocial themselves. And that's partially true, right? Or negative influences, right? So at a young age. But I figured it could be any age. I figured that, look, you can change somebody's antisocial tendencies, by the time they're 30, and say, well, look, we've done all we can to sort of reteach you and re-educate you, and now you're going to be a pro-social, so the good socialization, pro-social member of society. Well, it turns out that's actually not the case. And so antisocial behavior is almost impossible to eradicate from children by the time they're leaving kindergarten, right? And you think to yourself, no, that's not true. It's like you just take a kid and you give them the right advice and guidance, and it's like now you've changed their personalities completely, right? And now they are respectable members of society, and it doesn't matter if they're 7 years old now, right, in the second grade, they're going to be respectable members of society, and they're not going to break any rules, and they're not going to give you any grief, and they're not going to hit other kids, and they're not going to throw stuff throughout your classroom. It's like, no, that's not the case. And so one of the reasons why preschool is most important is because it gets kids established with rules and learning how to interact and play with one another. And that's one of the things that school likes to foster, but by the time we start to foster it, it's oftentimes too late. So the parental influence on poor socialization is extremely big. So by the time they come to you as a teacher, it's oftentimes too late, unless you're one of the younger teachers, like preschool or kindergarten. And so how do you get poorly socialized? Well, you can think of the world through the lens of games, right? Everybody is always interacting with one another, and you can think of it as like a miniature game in some regards. Even little conversations are like a miniature game. And games have rules. Games have structure. And if you don't have rules, then you don't have games. Football has rules. Soccer has rules, right? Baseball has rules. Basketball has rules. Chess has rules. Checkers has rules, right? And if you break those rules throughout that game, whatever the game that might be, that would be antisocial behavior, because you're not abiding by the expectations that have been placed upon you in that structure of that game, right? Now, kids who are poorly socialized and they come to you by the age of, like, let's say 5 or 6, right? Those kids are, if they weren't brought up with structure and rules and meaningful consequences for those violations, flagrant violations, then you're going to have kids who grow up to be antisocial. Look, like if a little kid's swearing at home and the parent finds it hilarious and they just swear all the time from like age 3 all the way till they get to like age 5 or 6 and they go to kindergarten, it's like, yeah, they're going to be antisocial, and there's really nothing you can do to wire it out of their heads in some regards, right? And you think that you can, right? But it's more of like a natural tendency, right? I don't believe in free will. I don't think there's any evidence for free will. And people, they tend to just be rooted in some regards by their environmental influences, right? And so an environmental influence could be something like parents teaching kids how to swear, or parents who are playing with their kids, right? And their kids start to just like punch and kick and whatnot. Or maybe they take their kid to the playground, they just sit on their phone, and now their kid's interacting with the other kids, and that kid just walks up and starts hitting the other kids and beating them up and whatnot. And look, that's poor socialization. They're getting reinforced that behavior is okay. And so oftentimes socialization comes through play, right? And especially when you're a young kid, that's all you really should be doing is playing. And if you're not playing, right, that's negatively impactful. And if you're not playing with rules, then nobody wants to be your friend. And if nobody wants to be your friend, then you're not going to be able to play at all in the future, right? And the only people left for you to play with are the other kids who are also antisocial, where there's a much greater lack of rules. And so one thing that you'll notice when you're dealing with behavior, and I think this is right, I watched the lecture from Jordan Peterson where I found this stuff out. And now I don't necessarily agree with him politically, but the dude was a Harvard psychologist, right? Like go ahead and argue with that, right? And so anyways, one of the reasons I think that this has to be the case, and it is rooted in play, and I think this is 100% correct, is because you'll notice when you get into the classroom and you are a teacher, that kids, they're not necessarily doing things because they want to be evil, so little Timmy walks up to little Jimmy and he punches him in the face, right? And I mean that. I'm not just saying that, right? And not like he just punches him in the face just because, right? Or he'll just, shove him down the steps, right? They're not doing it because, they're trying to be evil, right? Now, you could argue that behavior is evil, yeah, right? But they're not doing it to be evil. They're doing it because they're attempting to engage in play, but they have no idea how to in the least, right? And so, look, poor socialization, it starts with play. And if they're not interacting properly with rules and expectations, from the get-go, when they're very little, it's very hard to work that out of kids. And so I was watching this discussion with this antisocial personality researcher by the name of, I think it was Richard Tremblay. And he's one of the people who worked with, I think it was Joanne McCord. And they focused a lot on antisocial behavior and how you can mitigate that in children. And one of the things that they found was if you take kids who are, I think, in like the first or second grade, and which by that time it's already too late, right? But if you take them in that first and second grade and you do the absolute most, right? So you take that one antisocial kid and you surround him with all pro-social kids, right? So everybody's really pro-social. And you just teach rules and expectations, with them and how to socially interact, right, with one another and etiquette, then, they tend to have more pro-social friends by the time they reach adulthood, if you do like a follow-up study, so like a longitudinal study. Now, that would be evidence of more pro-social behavior in the child. Now, the thing is, it's like you have to really be all in, right? But the problem is you can't be all in all the time, right? Because eventually the kids sort of segregate themselves in terms of their sociability, right? So the quote-unquote bad kids are going to hang out with the bad kids, right? The pro-social kids are going to hang out with the other pro-social kids. And there will be a mix between them both, right? But generally speaking, they will segregate themselves to kids who are just like them in terms of sociability. And I think that tends to be the case. So there's a lot of overlap, right? They won't totally segregate themselves, right? But, they're not going to, like, for example, like if you're playing a game with somebody who always wants to hit you and whatnot, you're not going to want to be around them, right? Because you're pro-social and they're antisocial, right? And so, because they don't know, they're not even doing it to be mean. That's just how they interact with one another. Nobody ever told them that wasn't okay, right? When they were little, and it's ingrained in their head now. So poor socialization, that's one very, very important thing for education. That's one of the places it comes from. Next up, lack of understanding. So if a kid is in class and they don't understand what the content is that is being taught, then they're just, straight up, they're just not going to give much effort for it, right? And if they're not understanding things in any capacity, why should they try, right? So you're going to have kids all the time, right? Like you think you're in middle school, right? You're a middle school teacher and you're not going to have kids on a kindergarten level. It's like, think again, right? Because you're going to have lots of kids like that. And those kids aren't going to understand the content, so they're just going to mess around, right? Because there's no point in them trying on 8th grade content if they're at kindergarten level, right? They will never understand it, ever, right? And even if they can understand it somewhat conceptually, just in terms of like hearing things, let's say you have a writing prompt, for example, they can't write it at 8th grade level, so they'll just fail every single time. And so, if they got a lack of understanding, it's going to be extremely difficult for them to, start to behave, right? Because they're just going to get distracted with things, right? And that's going to tie into a lack of structure here that we'll talk about in a second. But the next thing would be negative influences, right? So there was this researcher here. Again, this is pulling on from that lecture that I was talking about with Jordan Peterson. And he was saying that there's this one study, it's a very foundational, seminal work. And it was this study on Somerville. And you take this, you take a bunch of kids who are in a rough situation, they're antisocial, they've been identified on like a pre-track for criminality, and you say, all right, we're going to do all we possibly can, right, to intervene and try to mitigate this antisocial behavior, right? So then, you're giving them tutoring, right? Maybe a ride to and from school or something. You're helping out the parents a little bit. You're just doing all that you possibly can to help these kids, right? And then you say, all right, well, in addition to that, we're going to take these kids and for a couple weeks out of the year, we're going to send them to a summer camp, and they're going to, be allowed to play with one another. And so all the antisocial kids are there together, and they're going to play with one another. And hopefully we'll see what the results were. Were they more pro-social now? Well, it turns out after those couple weeks of the kids being together, when they ran the data analysis in terms of sociability, the kids who were less antisocial ended up becoming even more antisocial, right? And so that's one of the things you can think about with prison, right? You have a bunch of antisocial people together. It's probably the worst possible thing. The people who were less antisocial just become more antisocial, and it doesn't work the other way around, right? And so if you're in the classroom and you're trying to organize your class with groups and whatnot, the worst thing you can possibly do is place the kids who are the best pro-social kids with the most antisocial kids, right? Because they're just going to make the kids who are pro-social even more antisocial. It does not work the other way around, so don't think it works the other way around. So negative influence is huge, right? And so you're going to have kids, the most antisocial kids are always going to be prodding those who are more pro-social to do their bidding or to engage with them and interact with them, right? Because, they might not necessarily care about school at all, right? And so they're just, there to have fun, have a good time. It's like a little vacation for them, right? You get to come to school, you get to talk with your friends, you get to hang out all day, you get to have some good lunch, right? I mean, it's like a vacation home for them, right? It's like a spa, it's like a resort. And so, why on earth would they want to, do work, especially if they're going to get passed on to the next grade anyways, right? And so one thing that you'll find out is that you can't always hold kids back, right? It's not how it used to be, right? Kids can be held back only a couple times nowadays and just get passed on forever. And like, I really mean that. Like, they could have 0%, right, for like 5 years straight and still pass on to the next grade. And like, they could literally never pick up a pencil once their entire time. They'll still move on to the next grade. So it's, it's very rough, right? The negative influence is a big problem. And, that's going to be one of the causes of this, misbehavior, right? If you had a whole class of pro-social kids, you put one antisocial kid there, it's like, yeah, the pro-social kids might become a little bit more antisocial, right? But generally speaking, you're going to get a lot more stuff done, right? Because there's less negative influences there for people to mess around or people to bite into it. So next up here, we got lack of structure. So as a teacher, you should always be trying to fill your time, right? Never have any downtime. Downtime is your enemy, right? You don't want to have time where the kids can just do whatever they want, because then they're going to start to freak out once they do whatever they want, right? And they're not going to do things that you would deem desirable. They're just going to start messing around and doing crazy things. And so you always want to have structure, have a lot of routine, right? It's like every day we walk in this classroom, we're going to silence ourselves before we walk in. We're going to sit down nice and respectfully, right? Then we're going to do our bell work, right? There's no talking during this, right? And then we proceed with class and we can have a fun time. But we got to collect ourselves first, right? And so, lots of structure all the time, right? They should have a nice routine. They should be expected to know what they have to do. And, structure is also times going to come with expectations for your class. Do you have any classroom rules? If you don't have classroom rules, I mean, God, you're already missing out, right? You want to have a lot of rules and a lot of expectations that you quite frankly you want to see fostered in your classroom, right? And that goes with the socialization, right? You're doing all you possibly can to redeem any little scrap of hope that you can make these kids more pro-social, right? And so there are going to be rules, and they can't violate these rules. They can't transgress upon them, and you want them to exhibit these expectations all the time. So, for example, what would be a good rule? No profanity in class or making fun of other students, right? Always remain seated facing toward the board, and never move your desk away from the assigned area without permission. Never emotionally or physically hurt another student. Always remain silent unless instructed otherwise, and that way you're ready to learn and grow. And so, just lots of little rules, expectations, things that you want to see. And you want to apply those things equitably, too. And so that could be another thing that we'll talk about here in terms of what are some strategies and tools to help you with behavior management. If you're not applying things equitably, why should kids care about your rules, right? So if you're only picking on one kid for doing a rule, but everybody else is breaking the rules, right, that one kid's not going to care, right? And so you got to apply it equitably, apply it to everybody, right? So lack of structure, underprivileged backgrounds. It's like you have absolutely no idea, right, some of the backgrounds that these kids have, and maybe you do, and I hope that you don't, because it's extremely, and I hope that you do, right? So you take into consideration, but I will say it's a horrible experience, right? It makes you very, very sad, very depressed when you have to think about their lives and the situations that they have come from, because, well, quite frankly, it's very bad oftentimes, right? Especially in a lot of these inner city, very poor districts. It's extremely poor lifestyles, and I can think of many situations. There was this one situation where we had. Well, I don't even know if I can really say, but we had this one kid, and his parents treated him absolutely miserably, like a Harry Potter type situation, like just horrible, abused, treated him like a dog, right? He was just like property almost, right? It wasn't even like a human being, basically, to these parents, right? And he comes to school, the kid's a nervous wreck, right? The kid has, he has really hard times getting bullied, right? He's, he just can't interact properly, right? Because he gets upset with something, he just freaks out, right? And it's almost like a defense mechanism in some regards, right? But look, these are things that are going to sort of be ingrained in some of your kids, right? As a consequence of these underprivileged backgrounds, right? So underprivileged would be like, look, maybe you don't got the best parents, right? And then maybe poverty, for example. Maybe, look, you're constantly hungry all the time, and if you're hungry, then you don't have enough food on the table. And food is great for developing kids in terms of their, in terms of nurturing kids for their developmental growth. And so if they're not going to have enough food, right, that's going to be one thing that plays into the role. Money is going to be another thing. Maybe kids are getting bullied for dressing a certain way, or not driving a car to school or walking or something, just little things. It really depends on where you're at, if you're at an uppity district or if you're at a poorer district or wherever. But underprivileged backgrounds, it's very, very sad to see nowadays, but schools are, around the world are doing a little bit better at it. The United States is always lacking, of course, but underprivileged backgrounds, these are helping to be mitigated a little bit as time progresses throughout the globe, usually in the Nordic countries as well as Western Europe. So that's pretty good. But underprivileged backgrounds, very, very sad, very depressing. Poverty, right? Homelessness, right? Like, look, dude, like if you're homeless, right? Like I had a kid who was living out of a hotel, and he would straight up tell me, he'd be like, look, I'm going to go home and I'm going to smoke weed over the weekend with my friends, or he'd be like, I'm going to, he's like, yeah, just do it. He just tell me crazy things, right? And you find out he's living out of a hotel room, right? His parents aren't really there for him. He has like no structure in the least, right? And then this, you got this poor kid here, and it's like, look, if you're homeless, man, and you don't know where you're gonna be staying the next day, it's like the last thing you care about is learning about like minerals or something, right? It's like, why should you learn about minerals when you don't even have a house, right? I mean, just think about it, right? I mean, it's no different than it's like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Shelter is going to be one of the biggest needs, and then we can learn about minerals later on, right, in our career once we become a little bit more comfortable. So, underprivileged backgrounds, very huge, very important. And then we got our personality differences. So one of the things that I study in particular is personality differences between different people, and I sort of look at the world through the lens of personality. And personality is about 80% heritable by the time people have reached their senior years. And heritable means that they were essentially born that way. And but having said that, if you're just like a young adult, maybe your personality is 50% heritable, and maybe it's 50% environmental, right? And so that means that about half of somebody's personality is a consequence of their environment, right? If it's 50-50. Now, right, that's only half, right? And the best way to conceptualize this here, it's like not everybody's always a product of their environment, right? The poor socialization is a product of environment most oftentimes, unless you got like a psychopath. That's one of the differences between psychopaths and sociopaths is sociopaths are sort of made, psychopaths are born, right? And so they're just antisocial, from nature with their, I believe it's like their sympathetic nervous system just doesn't react the same way to certain situations like other people do. They're more numb to things. But personality differences, right? If you're born like an extrovert, for instance, right? Because we all know what extroversion is, right? You can make somebody act like an introvert, right? Or exhibit those qualities, or vice versa, the other way around. You can make an introvert act like an extrovert, but the chances that they're going to like that is like 0, right? And so you can do it, but they're not going to enjoy it. And so these personality differences are rooted, they're embedded in us, right? From birth, right? As well as our environment. And the reason it's like 50-50 by the time when they're like, teenagers is because they don't have complete control over their environment yet. Their parents are dictating things that they have to do one way or the other. And so the qualities that they exhibit, and their teachers are, and their administrators, and so the qualities that they exhibit are not necessarily completely on their own accord. Whereas by the time you're a senior and you're like 75 years old, it's like, it's 80% heritable because you completely control your life, right? Nobody can tell you anything, and if they try to tell you something, you just simply do not care enough, right, to follow whatever they have to try to impress upon you. So personality difference is another thing. Some people have more antisocial personalities than other people do, and it's just one of those things that you could be born with, for instance, right? So maybe somebody's very disagreeable, right? There's a personality trait called agreeableness on the 5-factor personality model, which is the most popular model used for personality, and it appears to be right in my estimation. And agreeableness. So let's say you have a person who is telling somebody rules, right? And you got an agreeable person and you have a disagreeable person. The person who's agreeable will pretty much always follow the rules, right? Whereas the person who's disagreeable, they're going to combat you every step along the way, right? Because they don't want to follow those rules. They want to do their own thing. Right now, maybe they agree with you, and then maybe they will follow that rule. But if they don't, they're going to tell you, right? They're going to be very confrontational with you. They're going to have some conflict. And so on personality differences, that's one thing. So poor socialization. Again, these kids, they're not being brought up with rules and expectations. Nobody teaching them how to act properly. And these things sort of get embedded in them through their most developmental years, from like 1 to like maybe 5 or 6, right? And after one, like say like 1 to 5, right, or like 0 to 5, these kids, they can sort of get stuck in these like tracks of sociability, right? And it's very unfortunate. And again, they get stuck because all their peers are going to have to interact with them. And like again, the pro-social kids oftentimes are going to interact with pro-social kids. Antisocial kids are going to interact with other antisocial kids. And there will be a bunch of mix in the middle, mix between groups. But generally speaking, they're going to segregate themselves a little bit. So generally speaking, everybody will be very similar. But the line between antisocial behavior that leads to criminality and doesn't it's pretty thin, right? And so you can hop back and forth pretty easily. And so even if you're close, just being 10% more pro-social can go a long way. And those small differences manifest themselves at the extremes. And so poor socialization is huge. Ideally, you want to get as much early childhood education as possible. So preschool, you're always working with your kid, teaching them common decency and etiquette. And then you want to foster that as much as you can throughout their school year, so always be involved. Next up, lack of understanding. So we got lack of understanding, negative influences, lack of structure, underprivileged backgrounds, personality differences. All right, so next up, what is effective behavior management? Well, it's controversial in nature. Wow, we just covered that whole section, right? How fun was that? Where does misbehavior come from? All right, so now we know where it comes from. What is effective behavior management? Again, it's extremely controversial in nature, right? People have all of their own ideas on this, right? And people will fight you tooth and nail to the death. No, it's laissez-faire, right? It's anybody can do anything. That's the Montessori method, right? Children can just sort of be brought up on their own accord, and these little angels will eventually figure out what they want to do, and they will learn what they want to learn. And then there is no behavior issues almost in some regards, right? Should it be you just leave them to their own accord? They're going to do what they do, and maybe they come out successful. That's one option. Should be very rigid, right? You do what I say right now. And if you don't, there's some big consequence awaiting you, right? Restorative, right? Let's say you're a kid who is, you pour water all over the floor, right? You're going to have to clean it up. That's a restorative practices, right? You're trying to, rectify or make good the antisocial behavior that you put forth or perpetuated in the classroom. Harsh. Should behavior be harsh? It's like, look, some people, a lot of people, I would imagine, probably still support corporal punishment. Corporal punishment has been phased out a lot recently for the best, but a lot of people still support it. Should we have corporal punishment in schools? Should we not have corporal punishment in schools? And then not even that, should we or should we not, but is it effective? Does corporal punishment even work? Right? So that's another thing, right? What is effective behavior management? Should it be very harsh? Should it not be harsh? Right? Should it be very light? So maybe you get a slap on the wrist and that's it, right? And you're good, right? You can just go back and do what you want. All is forgiven, right? Very Jesus-esque. And then we got incentives, right? Should there be incentives to effective behavior management? Should you always be trying to do some rewards for this? It's who is the researcher, it's escaping me right now, who did the little shocks, or you give somebody like a candy or something, right, every time they do something good. I believe there was a clip in Big Bang Theory, the show, where every single time Penny, the not so smart friend who eventually became a pharmaceutical rep, so she ended up doing good for herself, she would get a candy every single time from Sheldon in one of the episodes, right? Whenever Sheldon had her do something that he wanted. And so that was interesting. So he's reinforcing that behavior with chocolate. Should there be rewards to things, right? Should every single good behavior be rewarded? Or should every bad behavior, result in the taking away of a reward? So incentives, think about it, right? Incentives is huge, right? And there is some controversy on incentives. And I have a friend who's very anti-incentives, and part of the reason for that is because, look, he says, look, you should just learn. You're here to learn. That's what you do. That's your job, right? And fair game, right? Like that's a fair conception of the world, or a fair notion of the world, or fair view of the world, right? But in the same breath, you got to imagine most people don't enjoy what they do in the least. Most people hate their jobs and everything, but the reason they go to work is because they have an incentive to, right? And their incentive is, drum roll please, they get money, right? People get money for going to work. They don't get anything for school. You get good grades. Who cares about that, right? But you get money when you go to work and you can buy things, right? You can not be homeless. That's a big incentive, right? You can have a car. That's a big incentive. You can eat food instead of starve to death. That's a big incentive. And, so incentives, right? How should you use incentives? Now, the problem with this is, right, now they would argue, they would say, okay, well, yes, right? But those are just more immediate incentives. The incentive when you're a student is you get good grades, then you can go to college or you can find a job that pays good. But if you don't have good grades, then you're sort of doomed, right? And that's fair too. But the problem with this is that kids are, they're not necessarily always thinking as abstractly as you might be thinking, right? So you can think, 5 years into the future, you can start a plan for that now. Kids can't do that, right? Kids can maybe plan maybe a month ahead at most, and that's about it, right? Kids, most kids anyways, can't plan that far ahead. And you got to be able to understand that, right? So the incentives that you place, like let's say you're like, okay, well, if we all don't get up out of our seat when we're not supposed to for 1 month, we can have a movie day, right? Well, that's going to be broken the first day because they don't care about what happens 1 month from now. To them, 1 month from now it's like not even like in the realm of possibility. It is something they cannot conceptualize, most kids, right? Some kids might be able to, but not most, right? But if you were to say like, look, 2 days from now, if we all don't get up out of our seat when we're not supposed to, then we can have some type of reward like a candy or something, right? But even that might not work. But it's usually like really immediate. That same day you want to have some good incentives for that regard, right? But anyways, that's just a side note here. What does that look like though? Should you not have incentives? Should you have incentives? Again, it might be cost prohibitive to have incentives, right? Because look, one of the things that they'll say is, look, we got standards to cover. We could spend more time teaching and learning, or we could, spend less money and put that money elsewhere that we were going to spend on those incentives, right? So it is controversial, right? What is effective behavior management? What's the perfect balance of these things? Again, it's a fine line. Everybody's going to have their own ideas of what that is, and that's what is effective behavior management then. There's no one right or wrong answer here. Again, you got to be thinking about that. You can't just pick one thing and say that I'm right and everybody else is wrong, because that's not true. Everybody can have their opinion, but some might be more right than others based on some characteristics here that we're going to talk about right now. And so characteristics of effective behavior management here. Again, these are going to be best practices for behavior management, but in terms of and this is like generally when I say best practices, right? Even if you don't agree with it, these are what people are going to consider best practices, right? And the reason they probably consider you best practices is because they tend to work the best. Now, not always. They might not always work the best, but they can a lot of times. So what is effective behavior management here? These, again, it's a little controversial, right? You have more Montessori, let kids give a lot of freedom, or should it be very rigid, right? Restorative, harsh incentives, right? Again, some opinionated there, but these characteristics here are really going to solidify a solid model for how you should be thinking about discipline, right? So starting off here. All right, characteristics of effective behavior management starts from day one, right? So when you get into a teacher interview, one of the questions that you're going to get every single time, and I mean this, I'm not just saying this, right? The only reason I say this is because you have to be, the only reason I say this is because I want you to be prepared. I'm not saying this just for fun, right? People are going to ask you, one of these questions is going to be, what is your behavior management philosophy? Or how do you effectively, what is your effective disciplinary management strategies? What are some disciplinary management strategies that you're using, behavior management strategies that you are using? What is your behavior management plan? Something along those lines, right? They're going to ask you about behavior, and you have to be willing to talk about these things. And if you cannot talk about these things, then you may as well go home, because there's no point in you staying for that interview because you are wasting your time. So here we go. Start from day one, right? So this very second that you see the kids, I'm not saying the first minute, right, after class has already started. I mean the very first second that you see the kids, you have to be already on your game, right? Day one, the first second, okay? So you see a kid walking down the hall, looks like they're going to come into your classroom, right? But they're going laughing, they're going all crazy, they're going nuts, right? And they're walking on the hallway. You stop him, you introduce yourself. hi, my name is Mr. Phillips, blah, 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 blah. Come on in, let me show you your seat, right? Welcome to this class, history, whatever, and like come on in, English, whatever, math, whatever, and you establish that firm expectation. But one of the reasons you're doing that is because you're collecting them, right? If they walk in their class on their own terms, they have all of the power, and you don't have any power, and you can't tell them what to do, right? And so because you're going to have to, and you're going to have to get used to that as a teacher, and if you're not comfortable with it, you're going to have a hard time, right? So the very first second, you have the kids walk on in, and you seat them down, right? And so that's the first second. The first interaction they have is you're stern, but you're friendly, right? And you show them their seat, and you're going to get ready for class, right? And maybe even have them do some bell work or whatnot. That's something that I would recommend every single class, right? And the reason for that is so that way they become used to just doing what they need to do for work. All right, so anyways, starts from day one, and you're going to want to focus on those relationships and rapport, right? So you ask something about them maybe, right? You're standing around, you ask them a fun fact if you got some downtime, all the time, right? Even maybe the first day, you definitely want to go around. You want to start to remember things about them, build some rapport, and eventually things are going to become reciprocal, right? Like, look, they don't know anything about you. You don't know anything about them, right? And friends know a lot about each other, right? And so if you want to get close to your students and understand things about them and have a good relationship with them, so that way you can talk to them about things that are not academically related, such as like, okay, well, how was your day today? I know you play baseball. How was your baseball game, right? Or did you see that Guardians game that was on TV? Or did you see the news thing about LeBron James or whatever? Whatever, it could be anything, right? Or did you, how's your, I know you said you got a new Xbox. You had played any fun games recently or something, right? Just little things, right? But these kids remember those things, and that's how you build a relationship, and that's how they will come to respect you, and it can go vice versa, it can be reciprocal. So relationships, starting from day one, and let's see here. All right, so another thing that we're going to talk about here is same with day one here. You want to have some nice expectations. I didn't put it down here, and I'm kind of mad that I didn't. Oh yeah, here we go. So second one, the firm/practical rules/expectations, right? So you want to have firm or practical rules and expectations, right? And the reason you want to have these firm and practical rules and expectations from day one, right, is because you want to make sure they understand that when they come into your classroom that you have certain expectations that they have to uphold. And if they don't uphold that, right, they're gonna have a bad time. Right, because there has to be some positive or negative reinforcements that are going to go along with that, or equitable distribution of those via a behavior matrix. And so we'll get into that in a second here. But firm, right? Firm, right? You're not just going to let people slide, no matter what. Even if you like them, you're not going to let them slide, right? And oftentimes people don't even like the word rules nowadays, right? They like the word expectations because they think there's like a negative consequences to rules. It's like, well, of course there's a negative association with rules, right? Because, look, if you don't follow them, that's bad. It's just like laws. Laws are rules. If you do not follow them, then you're going to get arrested and your life is going to be in shambles, right? So you have to be fostering these things as a teacher, regardless of what the name says. So rules or expectations is the same thing. But people like the word expectations nowadays, so just use that instead. So firm and practical, very firm, right? No matter what, you're always going to get them on it, right? Even if it's small. Never let anything slide, ever, right? Because if you let it slide, then they know that they can get away with it again in the future, right? Then you want it to be practical, right? So don't just have a rule that doesn't make any sense at all, right? Or it's not conducive to effective teaching, right? And it's not helping the kids learn, right? Because that's the whole goal of behavior management, is so that kids can learn the most, right? So if you got behavior all taken care of, then kids can learn the most, and that's what you want, right? But, make sure it's practical. Don't have like a random rule about like, don't eat soap, right? It's like kids know they shouldn't eat soap, right? But, you could make it a rule, I guess, right? Don't eat or drink in class without permission. There's a rule. It's a blanket statement, but it covers everything, right? So don't have like a useless rule. Have something that makes sense and is practical, right? Don't just have random rules. So there's like a list of 5,000, right? Just have like, I'd say probably no more than 20. Right? But some people will say no more than like 5, right? But really, let's say like 20. I have 15 in my classroom, and I think they're pretty good. Anyways, rules and expectations, firm and practical. And from day one, too, they should never say, look, after the first week, like, look, I know that was a rule. It's like, you knew that was a rule because we covered it from day 1 and day 2 and day 3 and day 4 and day 5. And then it was a recurring theme in the classroom for the next 175 days, right? So you knew it was a rule and expectation, right? So next up, we got structure. You want to provide kids with a lot of structure. Again, when there's downtime, free time, they tend to do whatever they want, and they tend to not necessarily care about what you have to say. And so when they first walk in, they know immediately, right? They're going to see you at the door, greeting them with a smile on your face. You might spark up a conversation, you might not, and then they're going to sit down, they're going to do their bell work, and they're going to do that for 10 or 15 minutes every single day, right? That's a nice, rigid routine, and they should never say, well, I didn't know we were supposed to do bell work today. It's like, yes, you did, because we've covered it every single day throughout the year, and we cover that as one of our big expectations. So every day they walk in, they grab their paper, they look up on the board, they start doing their bell work, right? Or maybe it's a packet, they start doing their bell work. Right? And then they know, look, every single time you got to, ooh, it's thundering outside. Every single time you start to talk or raise your hand or something, right, that we're in certain modes of our education, right? Like there's going to be times for fun. It's not all like rules, just, this, stern expectations, blah, 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 right? But it's, you got to be able to transition from things quickly and start doing work, right? Because that's why we're there. We're there to learn. They're going to have times when they can have fun, and let's say they're doing a project, for example. It'll be fun, right? But like when we need to talk about the directions, we need to talk about the directions for that project, right? And you're not going to be able to get that done if you don't have firm rules and expectations in your classroom, right? So, there's times for fun, but there's also times for learning. And when learning can be fun too, obviously you want to make it both, but there's times for strictly learning, and there's times for, fun and learning, right? When it's combined. So that's one thing there. So structure, tactical seating. You want to have a lot of, remember we talked about with where does antisocial behavior come from? You want to really structure your classroom. I find it's best to put the most pro-social kids together in one group, and then the most antisocial kids together in another group, and then like have a mix between some other ones. Or you could separate the most antisocial kids and put them like kind of close to you in your proximity, so you always keep an eye on them. You can always give them constant reminders of things. And it's just easier. So it's not always like you're calling them out in front of the class necessarily, because they're right next to you. You can always talk to them, make sure they're staying focused on their work, and they get done what they need to. And so tactical seating, very important. I do it in terms of sociability. I sort of rank order it, but you don't necessarily have to. You could just do a normal, like kids go anywhere they want. They could differentiate it themselves, which can be successful sometimes, but you might have to move things around a little bit. But it's tactical seating, right? You got to be thinking about these things. Like when I do a seating chart, it'll take me like 3 hours, right? Because I'll just sit there and think about it nonstop. And even the layout, what way do the desk face, right? And obviously you want to be relatively facing towards the wood, so don't have it like turned to the back or whatnot, but is it going to go to the side, the other side, or is it going to go forward, right? These are very important decisions that you wouldn't even take into consideration, but they very much help the flow of your class, right? Because somebody doesn't have a line of sight to somebody else who's their friend, that's good, because then they won't talk to that person that much throughout the class besides group work. And then you're just you're mitigating a potential distraction in the classroom. And when kids distract each other, you have to remember, this is one of the things that you have to take into consideration is that if there's distractions in the classroom, not only are they being a distraction to their own learning, right? But if they're not caring about their own learning, it's like whatever, man. It's like your life, right? And some people will argue and disagree with that, right? And it's like, yes, I'm going to try to help you and try to make sure that you're doing the most that you possibly can to be the best and most successful student so you have a good, successful life going forward. But, right, if you're distracting everybody else in the classroom, right, that's unacceptable, right? And so you have to take that into consideration, right? Mitigating distractions all around, so that way everybody can learn, right? Tactical seating. Next up, we got positive and negative reinforcements. So you're giving kids rewards and incentives to learn one way or the other. And so maybe like a treat at the end of the week if they do very well. And then, or maybe everybody does no phones in class. You don't see a single phone in class for an entire week, right? Then maybe you bring in donuts or something, right? Negative reinforcements would be something along the lines of, look, you don't get recess if you do X, Y, or Z, right? Or you're going to have detention after school if you're constantly out of your seat, misbehaving, not doing your work, right? So positive and negative reinforcements. Let me get a drink here. All right, equitable distribution, right? We already talked about this where you want to make sure you're applying the rule to everybody, so very fairly. You don't want to apply the rules just to certain people and say every single time you do this rule, I'm going to get you, right? But when the very pro-social kid breaks the rule, right, you ignore it, right? No. You do it for everybody, that kid and that kid, right? And the reason for that is you don't want somebody to say, well, they only pick on me and blah, 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 blah. It's like, no. Equitable distribution all the time, right? And there's this thing called a behavior matrix, and we're not going to look at one today because your school may or may not have one, but all behavior matrix is, we're just going to mention it very briefly here, is it'll have a misbehavior, right, or an offense, right, and it'll state the potential consequences for that offense, right? So getting up out of your seat more than 2 times in class, right? Maybe a potential consequence could be a detention, or it could be a verbal warning, right? Or it could be, this or that, or blah, 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 community service, right, with the school. So there's a number of different things that it could be. But look, it'll state the behavior. So that way it's not like, well, when I did it, I got suspended. But when he did it, he just got a verbal warning, right? That way it's saying like, look, there is a certain offense, and that offense is always going to have, the consequence for that offense is always going to be X, Y, or Z. Right? And so that's the behavior matrix, right? So it can be useful in your classroom, a little bit hard to apply. Again, you don't have sole authority as a teacher in the classroom. I wish you did, right? But you don't have sole authority, right? Because administrators can oftentimes do punishments that you simply cannot do, or consequences that you simply cannot do, such as like detention, for instance, right? Maybe they allow you to hand out detention, maybe they don't. And oftentimes they probably will, but maybe a suspension, for instance, right? Maybe you don't have the power to do that. Or pull them out of class at any given point. And so you got to take that into consideration. Meaningful consequences. They got to be meaningful. They actually have to care about them, right? We'll have kids. I always joke around. I won't even say it, but I always got this. There's this one situation I had this one time where there's this kid who we had a parent-teacher conference, and he was probably the most intelligent kid in our entire middle school. But he's very antisocial, right? So he doesn't care about anything. Right, but he's extremely intelligent. I don't say that about everybody, right? Because a lot of teachers would be like, well, they're all intelligent. It's like, no, because if everybody was intelligent, the term intelligence loses all of its meaning, right? And so not everybody's intelligent, right? But when I'm saying that they're intelligent, they're extremely intelligent, right? But they were also extremely antisocial. And the mom was like, look, I've done everything that I possibly can. She's like, I've taken away this. He just sits there in his room and stares at a wall. And he's fine with it. Like, he just doesn't care. Right? And it's like, oh my God. It's like, what more can you do, right? And so the consequence is just simply not meaningful to him. You have to think of something that's meaningful. Now, obviously it has to be ethical too, but like a meaningful consequence for that person might be like a Beyond Scared Straight program or something, right? Because if nothing else is working, right, and obviously you don't want to do any physical punishments because that's bad. You don't want to do any corporal punishment. And so, meaningful consequences. What is it? Like, and can you make it restorative? So can the kid, like if he's, like we have one instance where kids are smashing carrots on the ground, right? Maybe a restorative practice would be they got to clean up the carrots, right? And so that's restorative, right? Or they're trying to make right their wrongs. And so meaningful consequence. They actually have to value it because otherwise it's not important. So like if you just say, hey, little Timmy, you can't do that again next time. Don't do that, okay? Right? They don't care about that. Are you kidding me? Right? So you got to make sure it's a meaningful consequence. It's like, look, like you're going to give them a warning the first couple times. It's like, yeah, you're going to do that, right? But then the next time, it's like, look, you got to start getting a little bit more serious, right? So you got to have a talk with them, maybe call home, right? Have a parent-teacher conference, right? So these are meaningful consequences, something that can be restorative, but might not necessarily always be restorative. So meaningful consequences. So one of the whole things here is there's this SIF system. We're not talking about it in this PowerPoint, but we did talk about it briefly in the first lecture, was PBIS, a Positive Behavioral Interventions and Support, or PBSS, a Positive Behavioral Support System. All this is a system where you're using a lot of positive incentives and very sparingly using negative consequences, right? But they will be in there, but you want to use it minimally. And the whole idea behind a PBIS system, or a PBSS as it should technically be called, but people don't call it that because they just got the wrong terminology. But a PBSS system or PBIS system, however you want to say it, right? I hate when people say PBIS because it's really PBSS. Whatever it is, though, the whole idea behind education or behind behavior management is so they don't repeat that same infraction again, right? So, look, if you got a behavior that's undesirable, you don't want them to do it again, right? And so, look, you got to get on them, right? And obviously you want to make sure it's restorative, right? But the whole goal is not to punish kids. You don't want to punish kids, right? But you want to make sure you're doing something. Maybe it is a punishment, but the whole purpose behind it is not to like harm the kids or punish them in a way that's unnecessary, right? The whole purpose is so they don't do it again in the future, right? You're not doing it just to do it. You're doing it because you don't want to see that behavior repeated again. And it's for their best interest, right? Because look, you can't go to a job and just walk around and talk to people all day, right? Because you're going to get fired and you're not going to have any money. You don't have any money, you can't buy a house. and you can't buy a house, you're going to be homeless, and you can't buy any food, you're going to be starving. And it's just a rough situation. It's a rough life, and you don't want them to go down that track, right? So meaningful, and you want to use something like a PBIS system, which every school has nowadays, besides like maybe a couple in the country. And so very restorative if possible. Again, make sure they're not trying to repeat the same behavior as a result of your consequences. Then we got de-escalation. So you got to be able to de-escalate things. Don't start arguing with the kid. Never argue with the kid, right? Because you're snooping down to their level, right? And you're the one in authority. You never argue with the kid, right? And it's ridiculous. You should never bring yourself down to that point. Your word is final, right? And, well, de-escalation, right? So you can either say, look, I'm not going to argue with you, right? You can either calm down right now, or I'm going to decide for you. So you can either calm down right now, right? Or I'm going to decide what's going to happen to you. Right, and they're going to be so they're either going to calm down, or you're going to say, all right, look, we're going to do this. We're going to call home, or we're going to send you out. We're going to move you from the classroom, right? So something, if it's like they're freaking out or whatnot, I mean, you got to take things into consideration, but you got to be versatile. One of the things is that you're going to find out as a teacher is you want to keep kids in the classroom as much as possible, right? And different people have different interpretations of that. Right, so what might be as much as possible for me might be different than what your as much as possible might be, right? But regardless, you want them in classroom for as much instruction as possible, so that way they have the opportunity to learn something, right? Because if they're not in your classroom at all, then they're not learning anything. But if they are in your classroom for even 10 minutes, maybe they learn something, even if it's not anything that you want them to learn, or barely anything that you want them to learn. Maybe they can at least learn something, right? They can be better prepared. But you got to be versatile with it. You always got to be willing to change up things. Not everything's a one size fits all. You always got to be willing to adapt and come to conclusions that you might not have at certain points in your time or in your tenure as a teacher. So I'm very versatile. Maybe for in one situation, maybe you have the whole class is going nuts, right? They're freaking out, and you can't get them to calm down. It's like maybe you have to do something for the entire class. It's like, look, guys, we were going to do a fun activity, but we're just going to do an assignment right now, right? But you got to be prepared for that. You got to plan ahead. You're going to have an alternative assignment. You got to be willing to switch on a dime at any point. At any point, you got to be willing to change and say, look, this is the result of your own actions, right? Everybody's freaking out for the last 5 minutes. I've tried to get you to calm down. We're going to have a worksheet as a result of this. It will be graded. It's going to be due at the end of class. There's absolutely no talking right now, right? And so once you establish that authority, right? So very versatile, right? And again, it's different everywhere that you're at, right? I'm used to very inner city, very low income, very impoverished places that are very rough schools. I taught at a very rough school in the past, and the school I'm at now is a little bit better, but it's you're going to have to deal with things like that, and you're going to have to be willing to be authoritative. And if you're not, you're going to get all ran over. You're going to get ran over in the classroom. You're not going to have any authority and no power. You can't get anything done. And so you got to be willing to take that into consideration. But if you were in a better place with less kids like that, you're just not going to have to do it as often or ever for that matter, right? That was never really a thing when I was a kid, right? Because I was always in the classes with the most pro-social kids in the planet, right? So be versatile, but do take into consideration. All right, so what are some immediate responses / strategies? So you could ignore the misbehavior. So you could say, you've seen a behavior. I wouldn't say always ignore it, but sometimes if it's very small and minuscule, like you saw somebody whisper something very quickly, and you're in study hall, and there's no talking at all, but they haven't done it again. They barely do it ever, and it's not been a problem at all. Nobody else is still whispering at all, and it's just dead silence still. You might not want to break that silence by talking to somebody or yelling at them, right, or calling out the behavior, right? So very, very, very rarely will you ignore the misbehavior, but you can, right? It is an immediate response / strategy. Now, I wouldn't always do it, but you can. It's an option. Proximity, so you want to stand by the kid, right? So if the kid's they're freaking out over here, they're not doing any work, right? Everybody's doing their worksheets right now, they're freaking out, but they're at this table. I come up to them, I'm just going to stand right here, just be like this, just watch the classroom. They're gonna look at me and they're going to be like, oh man, I got to start working, right? So grab their pencils, they're going to start to work on something or look at the directions. And that's proximity, right? Get close to them, right? That way they understand that your presence is there. Because they don't think that they're being watched and they have no incentive to work, right? But if they know that they're being watched and that you're going to start commenting on them any second now if they don't start to do work, then they're going to start to do work. Eye contact with pause, right? So you see a kid, he keeps constantly talking, right? You're just going to be like this. You're just going to stare at him, right? it sounds wild, right? But if you just stare at him, right, they're going to eventually realize, right, especially if they're the only distraction in the class, right? So the whole class is quieted down, they're still talking. You're just going to be like this. You're just going to stare at him, right? And then they're going to focus on up, and they're like, sorry, my bad, right? And then they're going to get on with what they have to, right? Or you just you eye contact him, right? So you see somebody who's about to do something bad, right? You look at him and be like, come on, you know? And so before it happens, right, they haven't actually committed an offense yet, but you know it's about to happen, you just look at him, right? And hopefully they shape up quickly, right? And, you know, it could be like a little thing, right? But obviously if there's like a fight or something, obviously you yell. But, you know, eye contact could be one. Body language, right? So how you're presenting yourself. Be like, versus, you know, versus you just chilling there like this, just looking in the class, right? But if you're like, come on, dude, like really? Or you give it like a face like, dude. Or you get the eyebrows going down like a little emoji almost, right? So body language is one. Private conversations, right? So you take them out of class, say, look, what is going on with you today, right? Is there something okay? Is something off? Right? Are you all right? We can't have you doing this in class. This is unacceptable, blah, 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 blah. Private conversation. Public confrontations, right? You could say, look, hey, Jimmy, focus up, man, come on. Come on, you got to sit down and start doing your work, right? Public confrontation, right? Removal, immediate or later. Right, so if kids being really bad, again, last resort is removal. Administrators don't like it, and you don't like it because you obviously want them to learn. You want them to be in your classroom, but you might have to remove a kid, right? That's certainly a possibility. Addresses to the entire class. You could say, hey, or we could say, guys, we all need to start focusing again. Tone the level of noise down. Let's bring it down a little bit, okay? Thank you. Thank you. Down a little bit more, right? So something like that, right? You just try to you address the entire class for the misbehavior. Or you could say, hey, look, guys, make sure we're doing our work right now, right? And it could be like one student is messing around, but the reason you address the entire class is that hopefully they recognize that they got to get on track, right? And then you would bring it into a situation where you publicly confront that one person individually. So next up, we got point removal or loss of incentives. That goes with the positive and negative reinforcements. Again, positive reinforcement is awesome. You do something, you get rewarded for it. But then you could also lose that reward by not properly behaving. And then we got calls home, right? So let's say you are a teacher and somebody keeps acting out. You've done a bunch of different things already. You might need to call home and say, hey, look, I want you to talk to this person real quick. They're bringing a big disruption in class. I don't want to kick them out. I like them in class, but hey, look, we got to get done what we need to, right? And we need them to focus up a little bit more. It's unacceptable. And, well, yeah. And then if it's really bad, maybe you call home when you're not even during class, right? Maybe you call home and say, later on in the day, say, look, we need to set up a meeting because this is just unacceptable behavior. This cannot go on. And maybe even tell your administrator to get them in on it. And hopefully you can have the kid brought there too so you can talk to them. And a more one-on-one setting that's more serious with the parent too. Say, hey, look, man, you can't be doing what you're doing in class, right? I want what's best for you, but we got to be doing X, Y, and Z. It's unacceptable. If you don't do that, we're going to have some consequences going forward. We're going to work with you though. We're going to establish a plan to help you get what you need to help you learn and focus and exhibit that pro-social behavior. But it's a very tough conversation to have. And but when you're calling home in the middle of class though, oftentimes just say what the behavior is, talk to them, greet them, say how their day was, blah, 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 blah. Say, I don't want to kick them out of class, but I was wondering if you could talk to them for a second, get them to calm down. And more times than not, it works at first, but eventually they might get numb to it, right? So this is why you want to make sure, and we'll have another lecture on this stakeholder engagement, you always want to be contacting parents all the time regardless, right? So that way it's not every single time you call home, it's a negative interaction. Because then they're just not going to want to pick up the phone, right? If every single time you call home, right, you got something bad to say about their kid, well, next time they see you call, they're just going to hit decline, right? They ain't going to pick up that phone, right? So you want to make sure you're having some good positive interactions too. So saying good things that they've done in the class. And sometimes there might not be good things, but most of the time there is. And so anyways, yeah. So what are some delayed responses to strategies? Student parent-teacher conference, right? Ideally, I would like to see the student there at a lot of parent-teacher conferences, but don't be afraid to say what you have to, right? Don't get nervous because the student's there and you don't want to like offend them, right? But just, or the parent for that matter, just, you know, straight up tell them what it is, right? Or student-teacher administrator conference, right? So you're the teacher, administrator's there, and the student's there. You guys all talk about what you need to together, and hopefully you can develop a plan moving forward so that way there's less misbehavior. And then you got functional behavior assessment, so an FBA. Now FBAs are oftentimes used for special education students, and FBAs are really, they're a diagnostic, they're a screening tool, right? So you're surveying kids to basically find out the cause or the manifestation of their misbehavior, right? So is the misbehavior from something going on at home? Is it a peer in the class? Are they just not understanding the classwork, right? Why is the misbehavior stemming, right? And so like we talked about with where does misbehavior come from, right? Now, the thing isn't going to say poor socialization on the test, right? But is it a lack of understanding for the classes, negative influences around them? Is it a lack of structure? Maybe they only have misbehavior whenever there's a transition, right? So they only have misbehavior in the hallways but not in class, right? So there's lack of structure there. Or at lunch, maybe they have issues. Underprivileged backgrounds, right? Is there something going on at home? Like, parents are bad to them, or is it they just, they're in poverty, or they're not eating at home, or are they homeless? And then personality differences. And so you could even screen personality and see maybe they're just more disagreeable in nature. So that's just one thing, But delayed responses could be a functional behavior assessment. So you're getting to the root of the misbehavior, right? And that could be as simple as just asking the student. You pull them out in the hall and say, look, man, what's going on today? Like, you've just been acting completely uncharacteristic of yourself. I can't have you acting this way. What's going on? Is there something going on? Just tell me. Feel free. I always got you, but like you gotta tell me what's wrong so I can help you out. And so functional behavior assessment, FBA. And then we got some key considerations here. So then we're gonna have an example approach, and then we'll get some case studies in. So key considerations. What are some previous interventions that you've done? Right? If you've done X, Y, and Z before in the past, and it's still not working, you might need to move on to a new intervention. Learning of all students, right? And so if somebody's disrupting the learning of everybody else, right, you can't let that go on, right? Because look, you'll say, okay, well, if you remove a kid from class, then they're not learning at all. And if they're not learning at all, they're not getting education. It's like, yeah, but what about the other 20 kids that they're disrupting? And now they're not getting education because of that one kid, right? So you have to be willing to remove kids from the learning situation, right? So, but you gotta be, that's the last resort though, right? But when you have to, you shouldn't be afraid to do it. So learning of all students is the prime importance, right? That's like your prime goal as a teacher. Then we got the administrative position. Sometimes your administrators aren't going to want you to kick kids out. Or they're going to want you to do certain practice first. Maybe you have to follow certain steps before you remove a kid from class or do X, Y, or Z. And so, administrative position. You don't want to get your administrators on your bad side, right? Because they're the ones who are going to be able to support you. And if they don't support you in your practices, then you're going to have a bad time. And so, administrative position. Legal position. Is there any IEPs or 504s or any practices that you have in place for your, any practices that are legal? So an IEP is an individualized education plan. It is a plan developed for special education students, and that plan might have a clause in it that says, well, this kid is allowed to stand at their desk whenever they need to, right? Well, you can't violate that now because it's written, it's a law, it's a legal document, the IEP, and you can't transgress upon that. Now, but then any other practices that might be not legal, right? So illegal practices, right? So you can't punch a kid, obviously, right? But you don't want to swear at them, even if it's not illegal too, either, right? So you just want any practices that are, not only illegal, right, the legality behind them, but also unethical, right? You wouldn't want to swear at a student. That's disrespectful. You don't want to do that. So any practices that are maybe unethical, just don't do that, right? But yeah, legal position on things, you got to take that into consideration. So you're sort of bounded in some regards of things that you can and can't do. But then we got documentation. So let's say, and also too with the legal position, right? Like you wouldn't give a kid like a 10-hour detention. Like that's a good example, right? Like I don't think that'd be legal. And so any practice, legal position, or let's say one of the things that's been in controversy recently in recent years is seclusion. And seclusion in the sense that like you put somebody in a room, in like a padded room, and in like a special ed classroom, and you just leave them there, right? That's tending to become illegal nowadays in a lot of states. And so, practice like that might be illegal, but you got to know that, right? And, hopefully places are moving away from any illegal practices. So anyways, documentation. You got to be documenting things sometimes. Make sure you're constantly writing things up. You're being honest and fair in your documentation. And that way you can show established patterns when you need to, right? So maybe you document it yourself, or you document it formally for a referral or a write-up. So documentation. Multiple courses of action, but strive for careful determinations. And so, again, there's lots of strategies that you can use, but, again, strive for careful determinations on things. Next up, an example approach, right? So what would be a good example here? A kid's constantly out of their seat, they're talking to others, right, and they won't do their work, right? That's going to be the situation. They're constantly out of their seat, they're talking to others, and they won't do their work. Right? What's an example of what you would do? So you address and remind the class, say, hey guys, make sure we're seated doing our work, right? Something like that, right? I don't know. And then 2, publicly confront the individual. Say, hey, Jimmy, sit down in your seat. Come on, we got to start doing our work, man. Come on. And maybe you even walk by them a little bit. So proximity. Say, come on, get on. I'll get you started, right? Come on, you get them started, right? And then you say, private conversation. Next, so you're like, dude, come on. Seriously, come on. Meet me outside. Come on, we can't have you messing around. So then we'll talk outside for a little bit, a minute. And then we'll call home next. Say, look, I've done all I can today. I just talked to them outside even, right? They're still not shaping up. I want them in class. I don't want to kick them out. But I was wondering if you could talk to them, get them to calm down, do their work. That's all I want. And then the parent will talk to them a little bit. Maybe they can do something, maybe they can't. And then if not, if the situation is still going on, misbehavior is still continuing, remove them from class, right? Get rid of them, right? And they have to have some consequence, right? They can't you can't let the behavior go on and subsist because they're just never going to learn otherwise, right? Like I've been in situations where kids have no consequences for things and they just keep, they'll do whatever they want, right? And they can get away with it. They know they can do whatever they want, so they'll get away with it and, well, all of a sudden you're not in control anymore. And that's the last thing that you want. You're not going to be able to effectively teach anymore. Because not only are they messing up their education, they're messing up the education of others, which is the last thing that you need. All right, so now we got some case studies here. So here we go. So I'm going to give a scenario here, a situation, right? And then you guys can either pause the video, or you could just take a minute to think about it while I'm talking, or you can just listen to me. And so either pause the video, read it out, and think about what you would do or a strategy that you would take. And I'll just give you an example of things that you could do, right? So situation 1, a student uses profanity in class on multiple occasions, right? Profanity in class on multiple occasions, right? So you might want to start off, say, hey, give them a warning, right? After that, you're going to want to meet with them outside, right? After that, again, call home. You can't have profanity going on in a classroom. It's not okay. But sometimes you might not want to kick them out for it all the time, It really does depend. If it's a repeated, flagrant violation of the rules, it's constantly disruptive, or maybe it's aimed at other people, that's definitely got to end. But if they're just swearing, generally speaking, in their own monologues, maybe it's not necessarily the worst, but you may not want to kick them out for it. But if you've done all you can and still ain't working, you're going to need to seriously have a conversation. Most likely a parent-teacher conference would be something along the lines of what you could do. Situation 2, a student uses profanity toward the teacher. Now that is absolutely unacceptable. There shall be no disrespect toward the teacher for any reason at all, in the least. That is definitely unacceptable. So student using profanity against a teacher, that's not cool, man. You cannot have a kid cussing you out in class because the second you let that slide, everybody's going to think that they can get away with that, right? So you kick them out, you remove them from the class. That is completely unacceptable. Right, so the student uses profanity towards the teacher, not cool, right? And that's like an immediate, like you're jumping up stages in terms of what strategy you're going to use, right? So you got a lot of responses and strategies, right? These aren't all of them. There's a lot more strategies than these that you could use, right? But community service is even another strategy, right? That we didn't even talk about. But an example, so they help out around the school is what I mean by that. But anyways, not cool to have a kid using profanity towards a teacher, right? So in the example approach, you immediately remove them from class, right? And let the administrator handle with them. So anyways, situation 3, a student begins playing with a lighter in class. Again, immediate removal from class, right? But not only that, right? You should try to confiscate that lighter because that's considered a weapon, right? So you want to grab that lighter from them if you can, but never try to get physical with the kid, right? You never try to restrain a kid. You never try to physically get in any altercation whatsoever with the kid. That's for an administrator who, I think it's called CPI training. They got to get trained to use physicality, right? And because it's a liability issue. Even if you're legally protected, which you probably would be legally protected, the school is not going to protect you, right? So any lawsuits or anything, that's all on you. You're going to have to pay for that out of pocket. So maybe even get yourself some self-defense insurance. That's definitely something that you should look into if you're a teacher, because it just protects you, and especially if you're in a very rough place. I have some self-defense insurance, U.S. Shield Law. Pretty nice, very cheap, very affordable, protects you in any instance of a situation like that. Or join a teacher society, Kappa Delta Pi, the Honor Society for Educators, if you can get in. They offer $1 million in liability insurance just for the membership. And so any situation like that, they would protect you, right, if your union's not going to. But there shouldn't be an issue with just grabbing a lighter, right? But breaking up a fight, for instance, that could get physical. You don't want to do anything like that. But anyways, let's say you're grabbing a lighter. If they won't give it up, right, you just try to keep an eye on them and maybe have somebody else watch your class real quick. Certainly immediately call an administrator on your phone or wherever, class phone, page them, do whatever, get security down. You got to get the lighter away. It's considered a weapon. Not good, right? So immediately jumping up stages, right? Next up, situation 4. A student decides to stand by their desk instead of sitting despite a non-standing policy. So there's a couple approaches here. One of the things that I do is I have a social emotional area in my classroom. And so they have a little area that students can just stand in if they want to, right? And that way they can just get out the energy, right? But they're only going to stand there for 5-10 minutes, and they're going to have to go back to their desk. And that's an expectation that I have. But you work with them a little bit, right? So you're not yelling at them necessarily like, look, come on, you're going to need to sit down if it's still not working. Look, you can either go to social emotion area for 5-10 minutes, but you're going to have to come back. So be willing. If you're going to go there, you have to come back now. You got to do work, right? Or do work in the social emotion area where you can stand, right? But you're not just going to stand at your desk, right? So that's one thing that I have, but that's just a concession that I've made where they do have a social emotional area, right? So decide to stand by their desk instead of sitting. That's by non-standing policy. Again, you can go down a nice breakdown. Say you tell the class, hey guys, you all need to be sitting down during our work, right? Jimmy, sit down. Come on, I told you. I reminded you a bunch. Sit down. Start walking over to them, right? Try to get in their proximity. Make sure get them started on their work too, so that way they're starting to focus up a little bit, retain their focus, or re-retain their focus, realign their focus. I don't know what the right word is for that. Regather their focus, right? And then next up, call home, maybe conversation outside or whatever, right? But you gotta get on that. Situation 5, student arrives to class smelling of illicit substances. This is a very difficult situation. I've had kids before in the past. They'll come to school smelling like illicit substances such as marijuana, and it's very unfortunate because even if they're not doing it, their parents might be doing it around them, or tobacco for that matter. Maybe they'll come to school smelling smoke, and if the kid's telling you that they're doing it, obviously you might need to call child services, remove them from class, especially if they say they have it on them or that they were doing it. But if a student arrives just smelling like that, the first thing I would do is I would contact the administrator and I would just leave it be. I wouldn't engage with the kid, right? Because you don't know what the situation is. Their parent could have been doing it and they're just subjected to the whims of their parent. Unfortunate as it is, right? But I would tell an administrator so that way you're protected. That way, you made them alert of the situation, and nothing can ever come back to bite you. Next up, situation 6, a student arrives late to class 20 seconds after the bell. So look, again, it's a tough one, right? So a kid comes 20 seconds late. They do it once or twice. You give them a warning, say, look, we can't have this going on. But I'm going to let it slide this one time. I want you to get in class, but just try to hurry it up next time, okay? Or then you say, all right, come on, why were you late, right? You were in the bathroom? All right, come on in, 20 seconds late, right? Don't let it happen again, okay? So you're just reminding them the first few times, right? But it becomes a repeated pattern, and it's constant. It's like a constant abuse, right? Then you want to start trying to escalate it, right? So say, come on, you're gonna have to go get a pass from the office before you come back in, right? And some schools have a policy like that regardless, right? So maybe you don't even have control over it in some places. Maybe you just immediately send them to the office. You got to go get a pass, right? You're going to get detention because you're late to class, right? But maybe in some places you can let it slide or whatnot, or maybe even let it slide the first couple times for some kids, like the first week or something. But after that, you can't do it. It's unacceptable. 20 seconds after the bell. And so, again, not cool. But it could be fine the first few times. But if it's repeated, that's when it becomes an issue. Okay? So the first a time or two, look, we're all late to things sometimes. Students are no different. Give them a break. But when it's constant, get on their case. Situation 7, during small group discussions, one student makes sexual remarks about another student who appears visibly uncomfortable. Absolutely unacceptable, especially if you saw it and immediately remove it from the class, right? And especially if that other student's uncomfortable, maybe you want to talk with them too. You want to separate them and get them out of class. It's completely unacceptable. There will be absolutely no situation where you want to keep a student in class for well, sexual harassment. That's completely unacceptable. No matter what, you remove them from the class, and you're going to try to let the administrator deal with that, see what they want to do, but you got to remove them, right? It's completely unacceptable. And then you also look at the well-being of the student as well, who was sexually harassed, right? So you take them and say, hey, look, are you okay? Like, seriously, like, you okay? Like, you got to talk with them. You can tell me anything, right? If you need to take a break, feel free, right? And worry about their mental health too. Next up, situation 8. During class, you see a kid blow their nose into a tissue and they eat it, right? And they eat it, right? I just had this situation happen a few weeks ago. It was our last week of school, and I was in the hallways. We're switching classes, talking to another teacher, and I'm just overseeing the transition. And I'm like, yeah, this kid. I noticed this one kid. He wasn't going to the class for the other teacher, right? Because we're all by each other, 3 of the classes. And she was like, oh yeah, well, he. So he wasn't even in my class, he was in somebody else's class. But I was like, yeah, he looks like he's passed out over there. She's like, oh yeah, I don't know what's wrong with him today. She's like, I just saw him blow his nose into a tissue and eat it. And I'm like, oh Jesus Christ. And this is a 7th grader, right? And so you'd think that they wouldn't be doing stuff like this. But I've experienced 7th graders eating like their assignments, like literally eating them, right? They just be eating them just for fun. They just eat them just because they taste good or something. I don't know what, but they'll eat that. They'll eat that. I've seen kids eat soap. They tried to eat soaps as a result of thinking it would the scent would taste like the fruit, right? Which is very interesting. You blow their nose into a tissue and they eat it. That's one thing that you got to take into consideration, and don't let it slide. Obviously, like, dude, it's not like against the rules, right? But like, come on, man. Let's be a little bit more, show some more etiquette, right? Let's be a little bit more appropriate. Let's not do that next time, okay? Like, if you're hungry, I can get you something. I don't know what you got to say, but try to make light of it. Don't necessarily call them out on it, but like to the publicly that much. But like, you got to stop them from doing that. That's just not cool. I don't know. It's just a weird situation I encountered. I'm just giving you my thought process on it. I don't even really it just blows my mind like that something like that could happen. But anyways, that was a funny one I threw in there. Situation 9, we only got 3 more. A student begins menacingly walking toward another student and shoves them to the floor as hard as they can. Again, this goes back to the use of restraint. You cannot restrain somebody, right? First of all, you don't even know if they're going to shove anybody. Maybe they're just looking like they're menacing, right? And they're not actually going to do anything, right? So that's one thing, right? But then another reason is like you don't want to get involved in fights, right? And so immediately you contact an administrator, right? As fast as you possibly can. And I wouldn't break it up unless somebody was like getting seriously injured. I would not break it up. I would wait because you're not properly trained. You will take full responsibility and liability. You're liable for any harm that comes, and if things turn south, and potential for lawsuits, this and that. Just protect yourself. Don't do it. But if you're in a situation that does demand it, then you are allowed to. If your administration says so, you can, and maybe do so at your own discretion. But try to avoid that as much as you can. Let the administrators handle it, or security, right? They're trained to handle that stuff. Let them deal with it, right? Not you. And so, but if you see something like that, right, you immediately escalate to get an administrator. Anyways, situation 10. Kid pulls out carrots. Kids pull out carrots from their backpacks and begin smashing them all over the floor. So this didn't happen in my classroom, but one of my teacher friends, this happened to them before. These 7th graders had a bunch of carrots from lunch and they stashed them in their backpacks, right? It's like this. They snatched them in their backpacks and they started pulling out little carrots, or maybe not from their backpacks. No, their pockets. I think they had them in their pockets. Just a bunch of carrots, man. And they put them all on the floor. They put them all over the desk, and they just started smashing them all into the classroom. Like 10 kids did this, right? So there were just carrots everywhere, smashed carrots in everything, right? And what do they do in this situation? Well, try to go for something restorative, right? Have them clean up the carrots, and it's unfortunate that it even has to come to that, right? There has to be some consequence, so maybe like detention or something. But you yell at them, obviously, maybe call home. But look, you gotta have them clean it up. That's the number one thing, right? They're going to clean it up, and they can stay in class and do what they need to do. Restorative practices in that regard work very, very well for cleaning up the carrots. That's why I mentioned it a little earlier, alluding to the future. And then our last situation here, situation 11, the class will not be quiet after you've already raised your voice. So this goes back to the versatility. Maybe you want to switch up and do a different assignment. So you do something along the lines of a worksheet instead of a fun project, right? And you're just going to do that for the day, right? And hopefully they collect themselves, or you give out homework, right? Homework would be a great one, right? So you get to stay on your project, right? But then you say, look, we're going to have homework as a result of this now, right? Like, I've tried being nice. Guys, we really got to get focused and collect ourselves here. And we can't do that if we are constantly, messing around, screaming, yelling. And, as a result of that, we're going to have some homework. Right? And so you hand out just a little, it could be a little worksheet. You don't even got to hand something out, right? You could just say, hey, look, write down this writing prompt. You're going to have to do it for homework, right? Or 2 or 3 of them or whatever. Answer this series of questions, or just have something handy, right? I usually have like a bunch of extra assignments that I'll just keep around randomly that you can just hand out for homework, right? And again, you don't want to do it every day, right? But when you can, it's a nice, useful strategy. But I think that's a really good one, right? That, or you can yell extremely loud or have some form of, signal, right? That lets them know that you have that they got to focus up, right? So like a blowhorn, for example. I had one teacher that I know of who has they got like a bullhorn, right? And they had like a big siren on it, right? And everybody just immediately, like, they perk up like, huh? And they look over, right? As a result of the bullhorn going off. So that's one thing, but it collects attention and gets them doing what they're supposed to be doing. So anyways, those are the different case studies, a whole bunch of them there. Again, just some examples, like you can handle things differently. And oftentimes, if you're doing behavior management very effectively from day one, you're going to have to do less and less of these strategies or interventions, right? And so, the ideal goal is that you mitigate as much antisocial behavior from the start so that we don't have to react to it, right? So you want to be preventative as opposed to reactionary, right? So prevent it before it even happens, right? By having those firm, rigid expectations from day one, nice structure, nice routine. You're building good rapport with your students. You're having a good time. You're teaching with great teaching methods, right? With differentiation methods that we talked about last week, project-based learning, right? You got the culturally relevant teaching, right? And then you add things into the mix such as, rubrics. You add things such into the mix of social emotional areas. You add things into the mix such as you're engaging other stakeholders into the educational process. And all of a sudden, the disciplinary incidences and infractions start to mitigate greatly, right? So you're going to have less and less and less of them. But you still will have a lot of them. And it really does depend on where you're at. Some schools are going to be infinitely worse than others. And so that's something to take into consideration. Like when I was a student observer, I went to one school, and it was one of the other schools in the city that I grew up in, and it was a high school class that was like I think it was like freshman honors or like 8th grade honors, and they were all little angels, man. They were angels, right? And then I went to a different school in Cleveland, and man, it was just chaos, right? And so there was a fight the first day that I was there. And I was like, whoa, that's crazy, right? So I wasn't even the teacher. I'm just an observer just looking at this stuff, right? But it's just, you can see the big difference, especially because it's not really that noticeable when you're a kid, right? When you're a kid, you're just sort of doing what you do, and that's sort of it. You're focused a little bit on your friends and whatnot, but you're not really systematically assessing or analyzing every little detail of behavior management. But when you're a teacher, you start to realize things, or an observer, you certainly realize them, because you're just like, you're looking at absolutely everything from a more objective lens. You took a step back, and you're like, wow, like this is really how things look, or really this is how things go. And so anyways, those are some behavior management strategies. Again, there's unlimited strategies, so you can do a number of different things. These are just some, right? Again, some highlighted, some delayed responses. There's a lot of different things that you can do, but it really depends on the school. Detentions, you got suspensions, right? You got in-school suspensions. Suspensions are actually horrible, right? Suspensions don't actually work at all. You really want to do in-school suspensions if possible. Community service is another thing. So that's very restorative. I recommend that a lot. So have kids do some meaningful task, right, to sort of rectify their wrong, or just gain some life skill, right? So that way they're just, it's benefiting their future. But behavior management, very complex, very controversial. Where does it come from? It's a mixture of all these different things: poor socialization, lack of understanding, negative influences, lack of structure, underprivileged backgrounds, and personality differences. You really want to remember that, where it comes from, and take that into consideration. If somebody's coming from an underprivileged background, catch them, give them some more slack, right? They're homeless, you got to understand, right? Lack of understanding of the content, if they're a little lower, you got to understand. So help them out more, scaffold a little bit more for them, differentiate the lesson a little bit more for them, help them out a little bit more. Poor socialization, maybe they're just, they're not socialized that well, right? Or they weren't socialized that well. And so you can help them out by saying, hey, look, man, Like, you got to remind them on the rules all the time, right? That's just what you have to do, right? And so always be on them, as you should be with anybody, right? So apply it equitably, but do take that into consideration. And negative influences, try to separate kids who are negatively influence each other. Personality differences, take that into consideration. Some kids are more extroverted than others, right? Some kids are more introverted, right? Introverts might not talk as much as the extroverts do, right? So take that into consideration, right? Give them some time to express themselves. So project-based learning, student-centered learning, group work, right? So that way they can let it out and they can be fine and use their innate proclivities to their advantage, right? You can help foster that, right? As a teacher and help them grow to be the best individual that they can be with their own strengths, right? And you can do the same for introverts as well. Let them work alone sometimes, so that way they're doing that, or have some silent work for the introverts sometimes too. So, it really depends on the situation. Again, very complex, can be very controversial, but it is something that you have to learn how to do as a teacher. And well, that's that. So anyways, my name is Ian Phillips. You can follow me on social media at Ian Phillips USA. This was lecture 3 on behavior management. The APA citation is in the description below, and as well as timestamps. So if you do want to go back and refer to anything, feel free to do so. If you got any comments, questions, or concerns, please leave them down below. Be sure to like the video and subscribe. And thank you very much.